Thank you much. Thank you very much, Simon. And I mean, what a huge pleasure to be able to introduce the current master of the Guild of St. George in what is, in one sense, his final act as master, but which is really, truly a wonderful and historic sort of moment to hear, and a privilege to hear Clive speak to us. Actually, it's quite a challenge to introduce somebody who needs no introduction, because you all know better than anybody what Clive has done in his years as Master of the Guild of St. George. And his achievement in that alone is extraordinary, and it's touched the lives of thousands, tens of thousands of people, and it'll go on ramifying, it seems to me, into the future in terms of the way that it will touch people's lives. So I just want to spend just a couple of minutes embarrassing Clive, but I'll try not to be too embarrassing, otherwise he won't want to deliver his lecture. But the thing about Clive, it seems to me, and I've known Clive many years, Clive has the most extraordinary and beautiful mix in his personality. He has an extraordinary quality of mind. I mean, he has a great intellect, but it's an intellect worn beautifully lightly because it's a wise intellect. It's an intellect that touches with the realities of life. He has a great heart, a wonderful generosity of spirit. Everybody knows that. Everybody who's ever dealt with Clive feels that. And he has a wonderful soul. He is somebody who, in my terms at least, is the embodiment of Ruskin's wonderful dictum that to see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion all in one. I mean, because Clive is above all, I think you can say, a poet. He's a poet not just in the words of his poetry, but in the way that he has, in a sense, imbued all the things that he does with a sort of poetic spirit, that poesis, that wonderful thing, that quality that Ruskin prized above all. Clive is literally a poet, a wonderful poet, and deserves to be read more widely. He is in the tradition, one might say, of great poets of the 20th century. Ezra Pound, who he championed a great deal in his earlier years, Donald Davy, Tom Gunn. These are all poets, the tradition of which that Clive sits in amongst. But he's a fearless poet. He has translated the poets of Hungary, whose names I have to confess I cannot pronounce. But to be a translator is another type of very particular skill. And for those of you who have had the privilege of hearing Clive read Ruskin, you will know that he has a wonderful way of bringing out that poetic voice of Ruskin's. Clive once read a wonderful passage of Ruskin's when he and I were travelling through Verona, and I'll never forget just standing there at the foot of this hill, sunset, with Clive reading this passage of Ruskin's. I mean, I've never forgotten the sound of it and the beauty of it. Clive is a great teacher, emeritus fellow nowadays of Sydney, Sussex, Cambridge. Cambridge students have over many, many years had the privilege of his teaching. Of course, he's a teacher through words, of writing, of editing. Some of his anthologies, for instance, his anthology of Ruskin, they've been so much treasured, not just because they're great selections, but because they have fantastic introductions. And that's Clive's teaching as well. He's also a pretty good tour guide. He and I have wandered through the streets of Europe several times, and he's always opened my eyes, both to the historic, of course, to lots of Ruskin things, but also to the contemporary, seeking out amazing architecture by modernist architects as well. And finally, Clive the inspiration. He's really going to embarrass him now. In a way, Clive is a spiritual leader. He is definitely a leader, but he has this wonderful way of inspiring people to do things. And he is a man of deep faith. It's wonderful to think that this year he preached at St. George's in Venice. I think that was a particularly special tribute that he could pay to Ruskin in that city that Ruskin loved. But he's also a sort of touch paper lighter, is the best way I like to think about it. And I think Sheffield's a really good example of how he has energized other people who've gone out and used their imaginations and their skills and energy to make things happen. That's an awful lot to lay on Clive just before he gets up to speak. All I actually really want to say, he's a great bloke and a wonderful friend, and good on you, Clive.
Thank you, Howard. I am well and truly embarrassed. That was extremely kind. Sorry, I'm just looking for somewhere to put my water tub. That was extremely kind, and this is an enormously moving occasion for me to come along and say goodbye. Not goodbye in a permanent sense, but au revoir, as it were, as Master of the Guild. And the Guild has been a place of such warmth and encouragement and excitement, and I'm so proud to have led it, and so happy to be passing it on in good health, I think, to somebody who's obviously going to be a really excellent master. So, let's have some thoughts about Ruskin, rather than about me. What first drew me to Ruskin was really his use of words. And I find to my regret that that's the very thing that puts some people off him, the thing that makes him seem to many people to belong to the past. And I do see their point. You need go no further than Ruskin's titles to see what the problem is. Sesame and Lilies, Munera Pulveris, Unto This Last. To me, such titles are infinitely fascinating, but I do understand the problems some people have with them. What do they mean? Well, the answer to that question, in order to answer that question, you first have to recognize that Ruskin doesn't think the meaning of a word a simple matter. Words for him are not simply transparent to their meaning, or not often. Ruskin's words are loaded with history, with the complexity of the ways in which they've been used over the ages. This is partly the poet in him, of course, but it's also to do with his interest in philology, the science of language, which was very fashionable in his lifetime, especially as taught by a great German scholar named Max Müller, who taught at Oxford during Ruskin's time, and also by Ruskin's close friend Frederick Furnivall. I can illustrate this with a very straightforward example, which, partly because of the financial crash of 2008, and partly through the Guild's Ruskin in Sheffield project, companions have heard a good deal of in recent years, and that's to say his use of the word wealth, and by extension, ilth, the word he coined as an antonym for wealth. A successful oil company, for instance, might stand as an example of ilth. An immense amount of money gained by directors and shareholders, but doing harm to nature and society as a whole. Now, most people would agree with John Stuart Mill's definition of wealth, as quoted by Ruskin in Unto This Last. To be wealthy, says Mill, is to have a large stock of useful articles. But for Ruskin, this is quite inadequate. In his understanding, it is one thing to have economic power, another to know what to do with it. The definition of wealth given in the Oxford English Dictionary, a historical dictionary, incidentally, one much influenced by friends of Ruskin such as Furnivall, the definition given is, and I quote, the condition of being happy and prosperous, well-being. Nothing about riches or money there at all. But wealth is also connected with the archaic word wheel, which we may know from the word common weal, a term much used by Ruskin's follower William Morris. And the OED defines that on the one hand as, yes, wealth, riches, possessions, but on the other as welfare, well-being, happiness, prosperity. So while there's some suggestion there of economic advantage, it's very much bound up with happiness, as we see from the context of Ruskin's famous motto, which I put on the screen: "There is no wealth but life. That country is the richest, which nourishes the greatest number of noble and happy human beings." So Ruskin's looking back beyond contemporary usage to the meanings implicit in historic roots. And we cannot follow him if we assume that we know well enough what wealth means, though we probably feel instinctively that being wealthy is not quite the same as being rich. This may at first seem confusing, and yet isn't there also a splendid simplicity in the way it shows us the connections between things? It is related to Ruskin's refusal to stick to what seems to be the subject, the way of showing how the appreciation of a beautiful landscape, for instance, might be continuous with alertness to injustice, or the curve of a Gothic arch with freedom from slavery. Ruskin laid down most of the principles on which this guild is founded in a book called Fors Clavigera, his series of letters to the workmen and labourers of Great Britain. No title of Ruskin's, as he well knew when he chose it, is more problematic or more loaded with meanings, often contradictory meanings. And part of the point, I suppose, is that one has to search for the meaning in order to really deeply understand it. He understood the difficulty well enough to devote several fascinating pages to possible interpretations of the title. And I want to notice just one of them, which is Fortune the Nail Bearer. Fortune the Nail Bearer. This is literal, and it sounds like one of those expressions you only ever find in classical translations. You read it once or twice, and you are none the wiser. Latin is in general much more concise than English, and its vocabulary much smaller. It's precisely its ability to bear so much implication that attracts Ruskin in this case. Fors, he tells us, can mean three things: force, fortitude, and fortune. The three words share a common root, and all are concerned with force or strength: physical force, moral force, and fortune, the force of circumstance. Clavigera means the bearer of any one of three things: a club, a key, or a nail. The meaning of the title at any one time can be made by different combinations of these senses. So force basically means force. But to complicate matters still further, I thought I'd look the word up in a Latin dictionary, which, as I soon discovered, does give Ruskin's fortune, but also chance and luck, words related to fortune in meaning, but somehow different in feeling, more arbitrary, more impersonal. It strikes me that my fortune is connected with who I am. Chance or luck with what merely happens to me. And that distinction surely reminds us of two other words that aren't in the dictionary definition, but are related in meaning: destiny and fate, which both suggest that what happens to us is determined by powers greater than ourselves. All 5 words refer to the same aspect of experience. It would once upon a time have been called hap, the things that just happen to us, for good or ill, without our choosing. Ruskin is thinking of that when he talks, as he often does, of, I've already quoted it, happiness, as in the greatest number of noble and happy human beings. Happiness was originally good fortune, normally something good that just happens to us through good luck. But can it also be something we make for ourselves? This is one of the great themes of Fors Clavigera. The ill fortune we have brought upon ourselves and the happiness it is in our power to create. One of the purposes of the Guild is to step back from misery and help to create happiness. And this is where the nail bearer comes in. If you don't actually believe that your fate or your destiny is imposed on you by the gods, you must either see what happens to you simply as luck or recognize it as something you have made for yourself. Ruskin believes that you can transform luck into fate. You can ignore what fortune offers you, or you can take it on. To take it on is to accept the nail from the nail bearer and nail it down before it can disappear. Something I've often noticed about people devoted to Ruskin is that they can almost always remember how and when they first caught the bug. Many of you will know the story of Gandhi, for instance. When Gandhi was in South Africa around 1910, he had to travel overnight from Johannesburg to Pretoria. A friend gave him Unto This Last as a book to read on the train. Gandhi read it through the night without pausing. And when the sun rose in the morning, he tells us in his autobiography, I knew what my life would be. The book, he tells us, captured me and made me transform my life. It might not have happened. Gandhi might never have read that book, or he might have dismissed it as utopian fantasy. Perhaps something else would have made him the father of his nation. But chance gave him the book, and he nailed its lesson down, which is to say, he decided to live by it. What is more, because it seemed so fateful, he remembered the circumstance ever afterwards. It was like an epiphany, a vision of the divine. Nothing quite so momentous happened to me, I have to say. The literary critic Tony Tanner, who taught me at Cambridge, advised me to read Ruskin, and I read a selection of him with increasing pleasure as I turned the pages. And I always remember how, when I first read The Nature of Gothic, it was as if I could hear time passing as I moved from word to word. I had the sensation of time slowing down. Each second was of immense value, like each word. But not long afterwards, Fors struck me in a number of ways that are more palpable. A graduate student at the time, I got a holiday job teaching near Croydon in North Surrey, where Ruskin's mother was born, and which was also the place where Faw's moving in to help a little here. My mother was born too. Faw's took me in particular to the charming little town of Carshalton, at the centre of which, where you might have expected a village green, was a village in Ruskin's day, there are two large rectangular ponds, like paired reservoirs. These ponds are fed by the springs of the River Wandle, which from Carshalton flows north to Wandsworth, where it runs into the Thames. Ruskin seems to have regarded this part of North Surrey as his personal heartland. The first chapter of his autobiography is called The Springs of Wandle. And in Faw's Clavigera, he calls to mind the stream to which my mother took me when a child to play beside. Deliberately associating the Wandle with Margaret Ruskin, both of them in some sense the sources of his life. Now, rivers run all through Ruskin's autobiography, bearing that kind of significance. The first chapter ends as its author's life begins, not in Bloomsbury where he was born, but by the, quote, crest-set rivulets in which the sand danced and minnows darted above the springs of Wandle. And the whole book reaches its climax with a great poetic convergence of streams, fountains, and rivers. Arbana, Euphrates, Tamasis, Tamasis Latin for the Thames, Liffey, Nith, and here we are again, Wandle, right near the last page. None of this had occurred to me at the time. I'd not read very much Ruskin. But Faw's had an epiphany in store for me before I left Carshalton. Walking through a piece of woodland parkland fed by the waters, I came across an enclosure of railings with a spring inside it surging out of the ground. It was just behind the house you see in the picture. The place had been carefully tended. There were flowers growing around a stone basin, and the whole thing was strangely touching in effect, perhaps because the purpose of the railings was to protect the purity of the spring, and they cannot have been terribly effective because it was right near the junction of two intolerably busy roads, the traffic permanently snarled up and blighting the delightful place with noise and pollution. Beside the spring, there was an inscription carved on a memorial stone, which read as follows: "In obedience to the giver of life, and the brooks and fruits that feed it, and the peace that ends, may this well be kept sacred for the service of men's flocks and flowers, and be by kindness called Margaret's Well. This pool was beautified and endowed by John Ruskin, Esquire, 1876. Probably that line, men's flocks and flowers, is wrong because the stone has been recarved, and I think it should be men, comma, flocks and flowers, but never mind. Looking back on that period, I wonder if it wasn't this discovery that made it almost inevitable that I should give part of my life to the work of Ruskin, who had such a sense of the holiness of things, of flocks and flowers, water and stone. Years later, working for the Guild, I was asked to come up with a formulation that would describe this outlook. We are anti-materialists, I said, who care for material things. That's a paradox. It came to me spontaneously, but I've come to believe that it's really true. Elsewhere, Ruskin quotes Tennyson, imagining speech for his Brook, famous poem called the Brook. Men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. But of course, as the ancient wisdom has it, you never step in the same river twice, because the water will have changed, and so will you. If we value life, we must also accept change, and ultimately, death. The only stay against that, and it's not a permanent one, is language, and in particular, language cut into stone. As I said in the beginning, I was drawn to Ruskin by his use of words, above all, by words that record what otherwise passes. The stone on Margaret's well is a kind of memorial to Ruskin's mother, who had died 5 years before. It was she who had taught him to love both flowers and words, the latter when she taught him day by day to read the Bible and learn passages from it. And he imbibed the glories of the King James Version. She too, like the well she gives her name to, is a material fact, though her physical presence has gone, and we wonder what is left of what was once a person. In those last pages of Praeterita, we're reminded that water too both moves on and yet retains its identity as Thames or Wandle. The inscription also reminds us, if we needed reminding, that water, like fresh air in sunset, like fresh air and sunlight, is not only the source of life, but the indispensable means of it. In Ruskin's fairy tale, The King of the Golden River, I'm sorry, I seem to have skipped a slide there. That's the memorial stone. I thought I'd already showed you that. In Ruskin's fairy tale, The King of the Golden River, the cruel black brothers go in quest of the Golden River, expecting to become rich. The good brother, little Gluck, who you see in the picture, goes too. And the picture is the new edition of The King of the Golden River, illustrated by Quentin Blake, who is, as perhaps most of you know, a companion of the Guild. Gluck, like the brothers, goes too, but caring more for life and love than for riches, he returns from his journey with empty hands, only to discover as he enters the treasure valley where he lives, riches of another kind. And I quote, "A river, like the Golden River, was springing from a new cleft of the rocks above it, and was flowing in innumerable streams among the dry heaps of red sand. And as Gluck gazed, fresh grass sprang beside the new streams, and creeping plants grew and climbed among the moistening soil. Young flowers opened suddenly along the riverside, as stars leap out when twilight is deepening, and thickets of myrtle and tendrils of vine cast lengthening shadows over the valley as they grew. And then the treasure valley became a garden again, and the inheritance which had been lost by cruelty was regained by love." So Gluck discovers why the treasure valley and the Golden River are so called, and the reader is reminded perhaps of the first page of the story. One of the torrents of water in the mountains fell westward over the face of a crag so high that when the sun had set to everything else and all below was darkness, his beams still shone full upon this waterfall, so that it looked like a shower of gold. It was therefore called by the people of the neighborhood the Golden River. Ruskin's message is now clear. Sunlight and water are the treasures which give the valley its name, the sources of life itself. Many years ago, in the days when John Ruskin was almost forgotten, a distinguished literary critic pointed out that the message of the King of the Golden River is more or less the same as that of Unto This Last, the essays on political economy, which Ruskin was to write 20 years later, which define the valuable as that which avails toward life. The inscription on Margaret's well had come about because Ruskin had found the spring polluted and disregarded. It had nothing directly to do with the Guild of St. George. This was a son memorializing his mother, but it belongs to the period when Ruskin was active in creating the Guild and also encouraging comparable interventions. The street sweeping in Bloomsbury and the road mending project at Hinksey near Oxford belong to this same period. The interventions have several things in common. None of them is grounded in a large-scale program of reform. They are all responses to particular circumstances, particular wrongs that Ruskin had observed and took it upon himself to rectify, ways of reacting to whatever flaws had offered. The projects are all very specific, and especially site-specific. Ruskin, for instance, passed Hinksey every day when he was lecturing at Oxford, saw what needed to be done, and persuaded his students to do it. Margaret's well belonged to the landscape he associated with his mother. If anyone had a duty to purify that particular source, it was her son, though he did it for the benefit of all. And it seems to me that this is how the Guild of St. George works as well. We do not ask the long-term value of any particular project. We do the things that seem to us worth doing at the time, and perhaps hope that they may prove exemplary and thereby change other aspects of the world as well. I am often asked, as Master of the Guild, particularly in this place, why Ruskin chose Sheffield for his St. George's Museum. Why not Bradford or Birmingham or almost anywhere else? And the simplest answer must be that force intervened. Ruskin's friend Henry Swan had established himself in the Sheffield village of Walkley. Swan, Ruskin thought, would make a good curator, and the house, though perhaps a little too small, was ideally, almost symbolically, situated above Sheffield and looking out over the Rievaulx Valley. The mountain home of the museum was originally chosen, Ruskin said, not to keep the collection out of the smoke, but expressly to beguile the artisan out of it. He hoped in time to have museums all over the country, but at this point, one was enough to get started on, and that one had a message peculiar to Sheffield, with the beautiful hills surrounding it and its famous craftsmen, the Little Mesters. I've come to believe, working on our Ruskin in Sheffield project, that Ruskin intuited something about the people of Sheffield, their loyalty and solidarity, their radicalism, which takes the form of resistance to coercion, their attachment to the distinctive beauties of their landscape, all of which make them his ideal audience and make them our ideal collaborators now. It's been our purpose over the last 10 years to nail this exceptional inheritance from Ruskin down, to dig deeper into Sheffield. But what Ruskin did at Walkley was also exemplary for the world at large, much as these smaller projects were as well, notably Margaret's Well. There is no way anyone can turn back the relentless traffic pollution that bears down on the corner where that well happens to be. But with determination and regular funds, Ruskin was able to keep one tiny corner of English ground fresh, beneficent, and beautiful. Alas, it is no longer so. As Jim Dearden reported in The Companion in 2008, the water table at Carshalton appears to have moved, and most of the year, Margaret's Well is dry. Moreover, on a recent visit, I discovered that the stone has now disappeared, probably buried beneath untended undergrowth. Sorry, I think I must be pressing them. There it is. Apologies for the dreadful photograph. I had to push my camera through the railings to get anything at all. And as you can see, it's rapidly growing wild. It might be a future project for the Guild to recover that stone, which is somewhere under that growth, I suspect. Or if it is a fact that the water has withdrawn, it might be as well to accept that even memorials die. I can imagine such a response occurring to Ruskin, who believed that when a building can no longer be repaired, it should be allowed to die with dignity. Certainly, if life is to be the source of value, our assessment of value must include some awareness of the end of life. It's surprising how much of Ruskin's work centers on memorials of one kind or another. Though the stone at Margaret's Well celebrates the flow of life, it is at the same time the record of a death, and the record of a mother's death is in some sense a preparation for one's own. The first chapter of The Stones of Venice, for instance, is concerned with the tombs of the Doges and how the good memorials express the society's acceptance of the limitations of human life. In the last few years, the Guild itself has followed Ruskin in coming up with new memorials. Let's have a look at a couple of them. Sorry, I don't know what's happened here. I appear to be. Okay, sorry. I don't know what, something did happen there, but anyway. This is one of the two stones that Richard Watts, who is a companion, I'm proud to say, designed for us in Walkley, the gravestone for Henry Swan. And here is the very recent gravestone for William Buckland Graham, which was unveiled in Ribsford just a month ago. William Buckland Graham, the man who cleared the land around St. George's Farm and was, we regret to say, so badly treated. I'm very grateful to the artists who made those stones and to companions Marcus Wade and Mark Frost, who wrote the texts for them. Commissioning that last stone was part of the Guild's Ruskin in Wyre project. The Guild's land in the Wyre forest is his other relatively large inheritance, and there too it has sought to dig deeper into the region. Ruskin, as it happens, visited the church at Ribsford in 1877. He was taken there by George Baker, the donor of the Guild's land in the Wyre forest, 20 acres at that date. Baker, who was in time to succeed Ruskin as master of the Guild, had invited him to come and look at his donation. He wrote the visit up in letter 80 of Fors Clavigera, but it was in a letter to the editor of a newspaper, the Kidderminster Times, that he reflected on the Norman portal and perpendicular tracery of St. Leonard's Church at Ribsford. The newspaper had recently reported that the walls of this ancient building were in danger and in need of restoration, which he thought would entail the destruction of a fine old building and the substitution of a faceless modern replica. Permit me to say, Ruskin tells the editor, that no modern architect, no mason either, can or would, if they could, copy these traceries. They will assuredly put up geometrical models in their place, which will be no more like the old traceries than a Kensington paper pattern is like a living flower. Whatever else is added or removed, these traceries should be left in reverence until they moulder away. But if they are to be copied, why in the world cannot the congregation pay for a new and original church to display the genius and wealth of the 19th century somewhere else, and leave the dear old ruin to grow grey beside Sevenside in peace? This has been dismissed as romantic utopian, which may be so, but it is surely also a powerful reflection on the need to accept mortality. If life is our chief value, there is no wealth but life, we must find a place for death. We erect memorials when something of more value, a person, a building, whatever, has passed on. But as most of the stones I have mentioned may remind us, memorials themselves are mortal too. They record a spirit which was once embodied and is now where? Part of the ether, for a time part of our consciousness. And what of this spirit expressed in the act of cutting words into natural substance? What of other forms of memorial, buildings themselves, for instance? Ruskin raises this question in The Seven Lamps of Architecture. Humans may live without architecture, he says, and worship without her, but we cannot remember without her. There are but two strong conquerors of the forgetfulness of men: poetry and architecture. And the latter in some sort includes the former and is mightier in its reality. It is well to have not only what men have thought and felt, but what their hands have handled and their strength wrought and their eyes beheld all the days of their life. But what are those forms of art less durable than stone or brick that are nonetheless required to stand against time? Ruskin was deeply preoccupied with a particular painting which obsessed him from his early life. It is a matter of obsessive interest for him, and it comes up as early as 1843 in his first published book, the first volume of Modern Painters. Two figures of Giorgione's, he reports, are still traceable on the Fondaco dei Tedeschi in Venice, one of which, singularly uninjured, is seen from far above and below the Rialto, flaming like the reflection of a sunset. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi is a Renaissance palace on the Grand Canal in Venice, just near the Rialto Bridge. It faces west, and its white stucco tends to catch the sunset. The name means warehouse of the Germans, and the palace seems to have been a trading base for merchants in southern Germany visiting Venice. It was both a store for merchandise and a hotel. By the 19th century, when this picture was taken, it was pretty run down. And Ruskin, in fact, describes it in that way. It was, he says, a huge, blank, 5-storied pile on whose walls the first glance detects nothing but the signs of poverty and ruin. They have been covered with stucco, which for the most part is now peeled away from the brick beneath, and stains of rusty red and sickly grey and black hang down in dark streams from the cornices, or spread in mossy patches hither and thither between the casements. Among this grisly painting, where the stucco is still left, the eye may here and there discern other lines, faint shades of that noble grey which nothing can give but the pencil of a great colourist, and subdued fragments of purple and scarlet dying into rusty wash from the iron bolts that hold the walls together. This is all that is left of the work of Titian and Giorgione. The vague reflection of a sunset is simplified here. But is it really a sunset or paintwork lit by the sun? At any rate, we begin to understand. These are paintings, frescoes by the greatest Venetian masters of the early 16th century, when the Fondaco in its present form was built. Paintings in a friable medium, colour mixed with plaster, on the outside walls of a building near the centre of what was then Europe's busiest commercial city. The prime position on the canal facade was given to the more senior of the two young artists, Giorgione, then about 30 years old, but only 3 years from his death. Titian, a young man of about 20, but already quite well known, was granted the side wall. Ruskin gives the impression that by the 1870s, these frescoes had completely faded away. In fact, though most of the work had disappeared by the time Ruskin first saw it, the scarlet shadow he identified has in fact survived to this day, harshly fragmented, but a work of unmistakable quality. There we are. It was removed from the wall in the 1950s and subjected to conservation in the Accademia. It now hangs in the Renaissance Palazzo Grimani, a little crude in the absence of the elevation for which it was designed, but still extraordinarily beautiful. It is not uncommon in the northeast of Italy, as also in parts of Switzerland and Austria, for buildings to be frescoed on the outer walls. But for masters of the order of Titian and Giorgione to expose their masterpieces to the wind and rain perhaps tells us something about their civilization, which is, as so often in Ruskin's perception, seems to stand as a criticism of our civilization, which would countenance no such thing. Writing in the stones of Venice of the vermilion used by Giorgione, the colour he earlier identified as scarlet, I suspect, Ruskin says this of Venice: "When her mighty painters had created for her a colour more priceless than gold or porphyry, even this, the richest of her treasures, she lavished upon walls whose foundations were beaten by the sea, and the strong tide, beaten by the sea and the strong tide, as it runs underneath the Rialto, is reddened to the..." I'm sorry, I've read that wrong. She lavished upon walls whose foundations were beaten by the sea, and the strong tide, as it runs beneath the Rialto, is reddened to this day by the reflection of the frescoes of Giorgione. The key word there is lavished, generous in the expenditure of colour and, by analogy, of skill, invention, work, and inescapably riches. Wealth may be a store of useful things, but a civilized society is one which aims at wise consumption, to borrow a phrase from Unto This Last. Towards the end of modern painters, Ruskin begins to look at the heroic and ethical dimensions of Turner's paintings, and he focuses in particular on one of the earliest of Turner's big imaginative compositions, the Garden of the Hesperides, in which 4 beautiful nymphs are guarding the golden apples of the sun. The garden is at the western limit of the known world, the so-called Pillars of Hercules. The West is symbolically important. We are to think of sunset and rest, of golden light and darkness, of Western civilization, and perhaps of death. And indeed, the name Hesperides means, Ruskin reminds us, nymphs of the West. And one of these nymphs he singles out for special attention and devotes a chapter to her, the Hesperid Igle. Igle, he says, in Greek means brightness. And again, it signifies especially the spirit of brightness and cheerfulness. He makes up his mind that the surviving figure in Giorgione's picture, which derives its rich colour from the light of the setting sun, is that very same Hesperid. He gets that image from a book of Italian engravings of the 18th century, which are supposed to be copies of the Giorgione frescoes when they still existed. Nobody knows, in fact, who Giorgione was representing in his picture. It is something Ruskin quite consciously and deliberately makes up, not knowing what power the painter intended to personify. He says, "I have called her from the glowing colour the Hesperid Igle." And equally deliberately, he associates the fading Giorgione fresco with Venice in her decay, dying in body, but in spirit indestructible, though that scarlet cloud may indeed melt away into the paleness of night, and Venice herself waste from her islands as a wreath of wind-driven foam from their weedy beach. That which she won of faithful light and truth shall never pass away. Yet there is also a sense that the Hesperides are not adequate to the task of defending the golden apples of the sun. Juno, to ensure the apple's safety, just to remind you of the picture, has introduced a more fearsome kind of custodian. In the middle distance of Turner's picture, you may notice a figure in repose there. Not very easy to see in the slide, I fear. Looking a little like a ridge of rock, but it is in fact a creature. It is in fact not just any old creature, but a dragon. And here is Ruskin's drawing of it, engraved for modern painters. In reverse, of course, because it's an engraving. The myth of the golden apples, the Hesperides and the dragon, is too complicated to unpick in this short time. Ruskin does it brilliantly in 2 chapters from the final volume of the work, and it emerges from his analysis that this dragon is the evil spirit of wealth, associated with hoarding and covetousness and discord. So this is really, in a sense, a version of Ilth, riches that are the opposite of wealth. Discord, because the indirect outcome of this story is to be war, the Trojan War, of course. Ruskin clearly understands the dragon to be the demon that drives industrial capitalism, breathing out the fire and smoke that destroy nature, causing waste and ruin, and through competition, promoting violent conflict. His opposite in all things is the bright and lavish spirit of the Hesperide Iglay. The dragon comes near the end of modern painters. In 1860, Ruskin delivered the last volume to his publisher, then set off for the Alps. There, almost at once, and in sight of Mont Blanc, he started his next book, Unto This Last, 4 essays on political economy, in which he repeats a sentence from the book he had just finished. Government and cooperation are in all things and eternally the laws of life. Anarchy and competition, eternally and in all things, the laws of death. Nearly a decade later, Fors, assisted by the painter Edward Burne-Jones, led Ruskin into the Scuola di San Giorgio degli Schiavoni in Venice. He found himself looking at another dragon, this time struck down by the force of a young hero who rides into battle without his helmet on. This suggested to Ruskin that the painter Vittore Carpaccio considered sight and thought in the war with evil more important than physical prowess. Leaving the head bare exposes the eyes and makes us aware of the thinking mind. The young man is, of course, St. George, the patron saint of Venice's Slavic population, as it happens, as well as the patron saint of England. The convergence of Venice and England, of the Venetian scuole and the English guilds, may have provided the germ of a new idea, a new way of making war on evil and nailing down the chance of happiness. the Guild of St. George. And it's worth commenting that Scuola di San Giorgio would be literally translated in English as Guild of St. George. 24 years ago, when I signed the roll of the Guild, I was gently mocked by certain of my friends. What good could be done against the all-powerful demons of modern life by a tiny quixotic charity founded by a crazy Victorian gentleman? Earlier this year, the online magazine BBC Culture published a review of the Guild's exhibition, John Ruskin, The Power of Seeing. The headline ran, "Was this the most important man of the last 200 years?" And when one reflects there have been Ruskin conferences and exhibitions and newspaper articles and books and what have you, all over the world in this bicentenary year, one can think how things have changed enormously since only 25 years ago those friends of mine made fun of me. Provided we keep on doing without our helmets and nailing down the opportunities offered to us by fours. Small though those opportunities may sometimes be, I think we can do and have done a great deal of good. Thank you very much.
Dear Clive, dear companions, first I'd like to thank Clive for this wonderful and inspiring lecture. I think you'll agree with me. I'd also like to thank the board for giving me this opportunity, and it's a unique opportunity for me to publicly express my thanks to you, Clive, as Master of the Guild, companion, and longtime friend. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Laurence Roussillon-Constanty, and I'm a French companion. I've been a companion for a number of years now. Since you mentioned rivers and water in your lecture, I thought I'd like to share a personal memory that to me is emblematic of the Ruskin turn you made when you first got involved with the Guild. Sorry, fighting with my computer here. Please, okay, oops, no. Got a very fine connection, so it keeps connecting to the Millennium Gallery, actually. The scene is still visibly ingrained in my mind as one instance of those few precious, casual, and yet deep conversations we had over the years as you had come over to lecture, on William Morris and News from Nowhere at the University of Lyon in France, where I then taught. We'd just been to visit the Fourvière Cathedral and talked about Morris, the Lights, and Ruskin, when you turned to me and mentioned your growing commitment to something different that involved Ruskin. There you were, crossing the bridge over the Saône River, and there was a sense of purpose, almost urgency, in the tone of your voice that I knew something had changed in your fortune, in all the senses of the term. Of course, you'd become Master of the Guild by then. 15 years on, l'eau a coulé sous les ponts, so there's been a lot of water flowing under the bridge. But I'm happy to see that the direction you've taken and the kind of pledge you expressed that day has been so rewarding to you. As you said in your October letter to members, the best jobs you've ever had, but also rewarding to us all here and abroad. About Ruskin, you once said, "I don't know, he just grows on you." And I think the reason the Guild has been growing and thriving since Ruskin's time and during your time as master is because, like Ruskin, you've always been attentive to people's wealth. And I mean by that, in Ruskin's fashion, and as you reminded us in your lecture, to their health and well-being, basically to their growth. As the network of Ruskin's Companion has grown, you have, I think, made us more aware of our collective potential to act, not against the tide, but surfing along the tide and striving to turn ponds and stagnant waters into flowing golden rivers. Perhaps Margaret's well has dried out, as natural resources on our planet are also dying out. But we can be very grateful to you for helping us believe that it is our duty to do what we can to preserve what can still be saved, be it rivers, monuments, texts, or well-being and happiness. As master of the Guild, you have been an inspiration, as Howard said, a spiritual leader to us all. And the good you have done, I am certain, will live after you, in Shakespeare's words, and will be carried forward most evidently through Rachel Dickinson, the new master, and through all the good deeds the Guild will continue to maintain in future years. It is a poet's talent to turn chance or luck into action, but also turn water into golden flow of words and connects people through writing. So I hope the love of words and people that you share with Ruskin will guide you along to continue on the creative path you started as a poet. Dear master, dear friend, I wish you well, wealth, and luck. And I thank you again for lavishly, generously spreading the word, maybe not as a prophet, but as a companion poet, and making things happen for you and all of us. I'd now like to hand over to Peter Miller.
We are, but allow me to, have a flourish. Now, this is a very happy occasion for me to be able to pay tribute to Clive on behalf of all of us. I must say that the 10 years that I've spent with him as a fellow director, I have enjoyed immensely. He has the capacity to slow things down and reflect. We don't rush to judgment at our meetings. He says, well, I think we need to reflect on that. And so things are cogitated and developed. But he has been extraordinarily hardworking over the 10 years that he's been master. He has transformed the Guild. Its ambition, he's a man who likes to say yes rather than no. And so we have more than doubled our membership, not only in this country, but in North America and Japan, Australia, New Zealand. It's extraordinary how the Guild has flourished under his leadership. And in looking round for something that would register that, something that we could give him that would remind him of that, we thought that we would combine something from Ruskin land, which has grown with John and Linda Isles and others into a flourishing centre for our activities. Something from Sheffield, from the collection, and something from Venice, which, as you gathered from the lecture, is a place very close to Clive's heart and is also somewhere where we've made very strong connections through his involvement with Venice. So I'm going to now unveil the object. I'm hoping it won't be too difficult. There we are. And then I'm not expecting Clive to take this back on the train. There have been offers. What it is it's a G-clay print of perhaps the most striking image in our collection of the west front of St. Mark's by John Walton Bunny. It's got framed in Ruskin oak, beautifully finished, I must say. And on the back, Clive, if I can just lift it up, there's a little thing that says, presented to Clive Wilmer, Master of the Guild of St. George, 2009 to 19, with many thanks from all his friends in the Guild. So thank you very much indeed. There is a card here which has been put together, it's more a book really, of many tributes from companions, and so that goes with it as well.
Thank you so much.
And you'll get the original drawing, but we couldn't just paste it on the front.
Who is that by?
Katie Kadiri Yui.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Right. Well, I'll leave the floor to you, Clive.
I have really almost nothing to say. I'm so touched. Thank you very much. Being Master of the Guild has been in many ways its own reward. I've said to a number of people over the last weeks that I've never done anything in my life which I have found more exciting, more stimulating, and more satisfying. And one of the things about the Guild that has been peculiarly wonderful has been the way the seriousness of its intent so easily turns into friendship and into cordiality. And I suppose it's true to say that the expression of good feeling between people is in some way the product of good principles, or maybe I should put it the other way round, that you can only have good principles if you have good feelings. At any rate, I feel almost palpably the warmth of this body today, and I want to thank you all very, very warmly for it. It's hard to find words for it, and I don't want to name people for particular things because that's invidious. The whole point is that so many people have been so wonderful to work with and have been so kind and warm to me and to others around us. So thank you so much for that. And perhaps I should also say that I'd like to thank those who have happily worked in collaboration with us. I think of, let's go through some of them. Obviously, Museum Sheffield, the Wire Community Land Trust, the Big Draw, 42nd Street, now just recently the Healy Trust, the many organizations which have come into the Scuola San Rocco in Venice, who have come to the Guild in friendship and worked together with us. So it's the feelings of companionship which stay with me most powerfully as I give up this job. But I should perhaps also add that giving up the job is not giving up the Guild, and I'll be hanging around. Thank you very much.